We're a community of secular humanists who are dedicated to improving the human condition through rational inquiry and creative thought, unfettered by superstition, religion, or dogma. If you would like to support our organization, you can go to our website, freeinquirygroup.org or gofigure.org, and sign up for a membership there. You can also support us for free at Amazon Smiles. So when you shop Amazon, you help support us, or at Kroger as well. So those are some kind of pain-free ways to help out as well. So Shawn Jeffers is a longtime member of the Free Inquiry Group and also a previous board member. We definitely appreciate all his years of service to the organization. His work focuses on advancing youth leadership development and especially issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we may also get to see at times his research assistant, Mobley. hopefully Mobley will make another appearance. With that, I'll turn it over to Shawn.
All right, cool. Thank you so much, Mandy. And it's great to see so many of you virtually tonight for being here at the Free Inquiry Group. And so I was reflecting, I was putting together today's presentation, that the first time I did a presentation for FIG was back in 2004, when I was working at the Center for Holocaust and Humanity Education, and Joe Lev had reached out about doing a tour of Mapping Our Tears, which was the exhibit of eyewitnesses to the Holocaust that live here in the greater Cincinnati area. And so part of that work of the Holocaust is going to come into some of today's conversation, and but also it was because since we've last been together since last month's FIG meeting, wanted to start today on a bit of a more somber note to highlight that two members of the Free Inquiry Group, Barbara Levy and Matt Kovac, have sadly died since in the past month. Matt was a personal tragedy that experienced, and then Barbara died out of complications of COVID-19. But Barbara Levy, along with her husband Joe, and George Maurer, and Edwin and Helen Kagan, and Wolf, and others were around in the founding, because we're coming up on 30 years of Free Inquiry Group being an organization. And during the 17 years I've been a part of FIG, there's been many times where we've lost members who had been part of FIG. And I think one of the things we try to do as humanists is honor a life well lived, and individuals who gave something and contributed something. And so Barbara being part of the group that was around during the founding of FIG and her legacy living on. Matt also was really spearheaded the Cincinnati Atheist Meetup and really started organizing online, and really started to encourage more and more people to come out and just be able to find community. And so some of us who are around a little over 10 years now, when we put up the billboard in town, one of the goals of the billboard was just to say, you know, if you happen to be a non-religious person, you're not alone. That there's other people you can be with, there's other people you can learn, break bread with, enjoy. And so Matt really brought that to the internet. And so both of those individuals helped build up our community here locally in Cincinnati. And I just wanted to take a minute to honor their legacy. If there's other stories or reflections that people have about Barbara or Matt, we'll have a little time as well in the Q&A if people want to offer up any of those. But just wanted to take a brief moment just to acknowledge that at the beginning of today's presentation. And as I transition now into the presentation for today, a couple things I just wanted to highlight. One is today, President Biden announced that we crossed the threshold of 500,000 deaths from COVID-19. And I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And so one of the things that we see, this data from the CDC that has been collected, but that we see rate ratios when compared to whites, is that Native Americans are 2.4 times as likely to die as a white person. Asian Americans are about the same. Black Americans are 1.9, or about twice as likely, and Hispanic or Latino, Latinx are 2.3. And so when we look at individuals of color in our country, those who are Black, Indigenous, folks of color, that like we recognize that the history that we're going to be looking at today has really led to a lot of inequities around health that has caused some of these dynamics to play out. And so I need to get down right now. Okay, there you go. And so I think that's an important part, is that this doesn't just happen because of COVID-19. This happens because of a long history that has gotten us to this point. But I think today's benchmark of 500,000, and I think from what I saw, President Biden was asking flags to be flown at half-mast as a result, to take a minute to honor those. And so we just honored one in our own community of Barbara, but others as well, that probably many of us have personal connections with people who have lost their lives from COVID. And so that's one of the things I think we're going to talk about. The other piece, I called this talk the science of racism. And I think because we want to talk through about how this has been in different settings kind of played out. And we're going to look at some different pieces as we go through. But first, I just want to allow us a little bit of level setting around getting us on the same page around terminology. So there's three key terms that oftentimes are brought up when people are having conversations: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And sometimes they're used interchangeably, and just want to name that they have different dynamics. So diversity, simply put, is just diversity happens. Each of us brings with us a range of identities that we hold. So we see on this wheel on the screen some of those that people might bring: race, gender, age, sexual orientation, ability or disability, religion, sexual, socioeconomic status, like these aspects that kind of come up. There's all sorts of other ones around where we work and where we live, and if we have accents, and all sorts of different dynamics that can play out. So there's diversity, those just, it happens because it's our identities. If one more person joined this Zoom call, the room would be more diverse because they bring a different perspective somehow. But when we start to think about equity, we really want to look at differently. So this is an example of equity on a more systemic level. So we see in the first picture around equality is that we have resources flowing to a community. So you have a community that's maybe got some broken windows or has been in some level of disrepair, and then you have a community that seems pretty built up. And the same level of resources are going to both. And so we can say, hey, it's equal, everyone's getting the same thing. But is it really getting people what they want? So when we think about equity, it's that sometimes we have to take into account, acknowledge that people are starting from a different place, and we might need to pour more resources or be more intentional about that. So we see now there are 4 pipes going to the neighborhood on the left in the equity one, and so now it is able to build up, where there's still only 1 pipe, because that's really all that community maybe needs to sustain itself. So we take that into account. When we look at last about inclusion, we see here a couple different examples, but so the first box up here in the top, we see exclusion, where there's intentionally a group in the circle and a group out. We see segregation, and sorry for the formatting that happened when I shared, but we see 2 different groups that are in 2 separate circles. We see integration, where there's people in a common space, but there's a separation. And so this is something that often happens, is people say a room is diverse, but it might not be inclusive because people are still kind of separated in some ways. So when we're really thinking about inclusion, we have this idea of that people are intentionally in a space around that. But these 3 aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, are really going to be kind of, I think, what we're going to be talking about, especially as we look at some systemic aspects today and how that plays out. So we have here a quote by James Baldwin, the famous writer, and he says, "The questions which one asks oneself begin at least to illuminate the world and become one keys to the experience of others." When we think about these ideas of diversity, inclusion, and equity, that it's like, are we really understanding others' identities in relation to our own? And what we're going to look at today is see some scientists who centered themselves and never looked outside of themselves. and the danger of how that played out in some of their research. And then others who really thought about more intentionally around what is the interconnectedness of each of us in our work. And so this James Baldwin quote is hopefully the movement, the direction we move towards. I want to offer up a working definition of racism. So this comes from the Racial Equity Institute, and anyone in Cincinnati who who is interested, the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, which is a local foundation, will offer up groundwater training, phase 1 training. You can look at GCF's Racial Equity Matters if you want to know more about them. They offer those for free, and you can get more details. The Racial Equity Institute is down in North Carolina, but they provide those trainings, and GCF locally in Cincinnati offers those up if somebody wants to participate. But their working definition is that racism is defined as social and institutional power combined with race prejudice. So there has to be power and prejudice, both to lead to racism. It's a system of advantage for those who are considered white and of oppression for those who are not considered white. Racism is a white supremacy system, which doesn't mean KKK, but just means that historically in our country, white supremacy means that whiteness has been put in a power position or has been granted more access. And it's supported by an all-class collaboration called White, created to end cross-racial alliances and labor solidarities. So that last sentence is really important when Racial Equity Institute, and we think about this, is because there's a dynamic oftentimes where that individuals who are white, regardless of their social class, that historically poor whites have been told, well, you're still better off than folks of color. And that has allowed people to, whether it was during periods of slavery or segregation, allowed people to maintain some level of supremacy and not question who's really benefiting from these systems. And so, for example, Ibram Kendi talks about that, like during the period of slavery in our country, that at one point there were 4 million slaves and 5 million poor whites in the South. And factory owners and plantation owners were able to get people angry at the slaves and not at the fact that like there was people who were maintaining the means of production and not allowing people, an ability to make a living. So they were able to kind of hold out that piece. And that's really oftentimes what causes this conflict or division between individuals. And that conflict or division can really cause us to not see other people's humanity. So this working definition of racism, just kind of helps us pull out some of those pieces. Other piece that we talk about a lot is that race is a social construct, right? Like there's a fantastic documentary that PBS did called Race, the Power of an Illusion. You can check it out free from the Cincinnati Library. You can watch excerpts online. But Race, the Power of an Illusion, in the first episode, what they really do is take a group of high school students, pretty diverse group of high school students, and they do a DNA test with each of them and have each of them say, who do you think you're going to be most similar to? And by and large, all the students kind of guess the person who has a similar skin color as they do when they do this DNA test. And then they come back and they get the results. And there's actually, the results, a lot of them are more similar to people who have different, skin color or appear differently than they appear in ways. And so we think about race oftentimes as a skin color, but this is not an accurate measure because there's really no biological difference between people. It's been much more societally created. And so when we talk about race as a social construct, a couple things that we're bringing out is that a social construct, generally, the simplest way to say it is, right, somebody once said it was this way and other people like went along with that. That's the like simplest way to say a social construct. So, right, like when you think about gender as a social construct, right, like we get a lot of messages growing up about how we're supposed to act. So there's like these ways, these different aspects sometimes play out, right? Like boys are told you're supposed to play with these toys or these things. But when we look at gender as a social construct, 100 years ago, the colors that we now associate with boys and girls was switched. 100 years ago, when a child was born in the hospital, they were actually put in a pink gown. So what changed? Was like society at one point decided pink was no longer manly, and then that changed, and now boys are put in the blue, outfit as opposed to the pink. So this is the way societal social constructs work is that somebody once said it was this way, and then somebody else who is in a position of power comes along and is like, actually, we're going to revise that and say it's now actually this way. And people sometimes go along with that. And so that's really what we're thinking about around these pieces. As we think about this as a race as a social construct, we also think about that, like a lot of these issues, whether it's around racism or sexism or homophobia or whatever the case may be, that they play out oftentimes in three levels. There's the internal. So when I'm thinking about different aspects of my identity, how does that play out internally for me? When I'm thinking about interpersonally, how does that play out when I'm engaging with people? So if Mandy and I are having a conversation, maybe what comes up around Mandy's identities versus my identities, and how some of those things play out interpersonally. And then there's the institutional, when our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors really engage, whether that aligns with or conflicts with those of an organization, an institution, or just kind of the broader society. And so that's really what we're going to focus on for today's presentation, is how have some of these dynamics around institutional or systemic aspects played out. So that was just a little bit of level setting to make sure we kind of understood some definitions, kind of have some common pieces. So hopefully that provides people a little bit of foundation as we go into look at a little bit more of the history now. If there's more questions on those, feel free during Q&A and we can dig into that, but I want to make sure we get time to really go through the history, because unfortunately there's a lot of it. When we just talked about the three eyes of awareness, and we talked about we're going to focus on the institutional or the systemic. So again, this comes from the Racial Equity Institute. What the Racial Equity Institute said is when you look at different structures, whether that is, in this graph, it looks at health, it looks at education, it looks at criminal justice, child protective services, and economic outcomes. When you look at those 5 areas, in every single area, whites are having a better outcome than blacks. And while Racial Equity Institute is in North Carolina, and so this is the data they pulled, pretty much across America, you could look at any jurisdiction and you're going to have the same dynamic, is that the outcomes of whites is going to be better across the board in almost every system. And so today we're going to really be looking at some of the things around the science of medicine. We're going to look at our science, racism. We're going to look at medicine, health, how some of these have kind of played out in just kind of schools, have played out in ways. But the Racial Equity Institute also says one other way for us to think about this is not just that blacks are 2 to 5 times more likely to have a bad outcome, but if we really flip that on its head, it's that whites only have a 25 to 60% chance of having a bad outcome. So it's also white individuals oftentimes have a whole lot more resiliency or a whole lot more opportunity when something happens to them, because it doesn't hit them typically as hard. And so that's really when we think about advantage, about how that plays out for certain groups. And the advantage now compounded with the history. And so now we're going to go through kind of some of that history to understand. People might have seen different versions of this chart or this graph. This is kind of in America. So the very first time that a slave ship was brought to America was in 1526. Now, last year, or I guess now it's been a year and a half ago, when the New York Times did the 1619 Project and talked about 400 years of slavery. The reason 1526 doesn't get brought up oftentimes is because there was actually a slave ship brought here, but those that were meant to be enslaved actually revolted and were able to secure their freedom. So it was 1619 was kind of the first successful time that enslavement really took hold in America. But we still think about that. We had over 300 years of enslavement in this country. Then we had almost another 100 years of segregation until 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. And we know Brown versus Board of Education was just about the integration of schools. It didn't really get to voting rights, which happened in the 60s, and many other policies and changes. So it's really been quite recent that 60, 70 years where we really even had the opportunity legally for some of these things to change. And so that's one other piece as we look at some of this, is just to recognize those pieces. So let's go back, and we're going to go back actually before we get to America, go back to Europe and look at what was going on. So most scientific classifications, when we start talking about, like when we start thinking about race in a scientific way, and scientific, sometimes is in print, kind of quotation marks as we talk about this, is in the 18th century. But Ibram Kendi talks about, that this actually ignores some of the theological aspects of race that date back to the 1500s, when Columbus supposedly discovered native people. And one of the things that happened is that it was argued that the native people Columbus discovered weren't actually descendants of Adam and Eve, because there's no mention of native people in the Bible. Now, the people who are making this determination, right? Who sent Columbus? The Spanish and the Portuguese, right? Like, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I don't remember Spain and Portugal, being talked about in the Bible, right? And so, again, it was like people saying, well, the native people in America were not in the Bible, but conveniently ignored that, like, I don't think Europe is mentioned in the Bible, right? Like, these things don't show up, but we just got to ignore that part, because unlike the James Baldwin quote earlier that we saw, that was more about us really thinking about our understanding of ourselves to unlock others' experience, they kind of had a very self-centered interest, and they kind of didn't really think outside of that. But if we look at that scientific classification that happened, so most of us probably remember in school, we learned, the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I probably got that order mixed up out there, but we kind of learned about those things. So the guy who did all of that was Carolus Linnaeus, or also Carl von Linnaeus, like depending on how his name is translated. But in 1735, he started classifying the animal species. And then he decided that he also wanted to do that for people. He wanted to classify people, mainly on skin color. And so Carl had 4 races. The red, the yellow, the black, and the white was kind of the 4 races that he created. So spoiler alert, I'm not going to tell you where Carl was from. Maybe by his last name, you might have some guesses, but I just want you to read, as I go through these slides, the descriptions that Carl came up with, and just listen to them as we kind of read through them, and take a guess at the end which one you think Carl is from. So the Asiaticus: sallow or yellowish, melancholy, stiff, hair black, dark eyes, severe, haughty, which means conceited, avaricious, or greedy, covered with loose garments, ruled by opinions. Americanus, indigenous people in the Americas: reddish, choleric, or irritable, and erect, hair black, straight, thick, wide nostrils, scanty beard, obstinate, merry, free, paints himself with fine red lines, regulated by customs. Africanus, black, phlegmatic or sluggish, relaxed, hair black, frizzled, skin silky, nose flat, lips tumid, women without shame, they lactate profusely, crafty, indolent, lazy, negligent, anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice, led by impulses and desires. And the Europaeus, white, sanguine, healthy, muscular, hair long, flowing, eyes blue, gentle, acute, clever, inventive, covers himself with clothes, vestments, covered in clothes, governed by laws. So as you look at these 4, anybody want to take a guess which one Carl was?
Is it a trick question?
It is not a trick question. He was
Swede.
He was a Swede, yes, that is correct.
The other thing you have to say, this was 1735. He never left Sweden, as far as I know. He didn't look at these people. Those are not very good descriptions, even if you ignore the bias.
Yeah, so a lot of this was he gathered manuscripts from other people who had traveled and was looking at others' work to make these things. Yeah, so thank you for that context, Wolf. But yeah, so but it was this idea of he never left Sweden, so he knew what he knew and centered himself. And so that's, I think, when we look at some of this, but when we read some of these bias or some of these stereotypes, have we ever heard any of these biases or stereotypes about some of the groups mentioned? And so 300 years later, these things are still somewhat causing us to have some of that bias or having that limitation. Other piece we want to look at is where the word Caucasian came from. So I happen to identify as white, and a lot of times, you know, like on standardized tests, sometimes it's white, sometimes it's Caucasian. So we have another gentleman, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who was a German scientist and classical anthropologist. Blumenbach was basically a skull collector. He would collect, he had on the range of 75 or so skulls of different folks that he collected. So craniology was his word. And this is what he said about the Caucasian variety, which was the description he wrote of the skull. I have taken the name of this variety from Mount Caucasus, both because its neighborhood and especially its southern slope produces the most beautiful race of men. I mean the Georgian. And because all physiological reasons converge to this, that in that region, if anywhere, it seems to be out with the greatest probability place the birth of mankind. So as you read just Johann Friedrich Blumenbach's description, this isn't science. This is him saying, I thought this skull looked cute, and therefore that's where man began, right? Like that's essentially what is happening in this is, you know, that there's that aspect. Now, we know modern science has talked about like, you know, that there, you know, the highest likelihood is that, you know, is that life began in Africa. You know, there's some different research or different theories about that, but that's probably now where the greatest probability would be. But just looking at some of these things. And so I think one, that's an aspect too, is around where Caucasian, you know, kind of came from. And then another piece, just on a side note, it's not a big part of the research, but it was also, though, this idea of, in this case where Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, how he describes Caucasian, it's just because of this skull that he found, you know, to be beautiful, that it becomes this really shaking or shifting sand in how we try to define whiteness or try to define race in different times. So in America, later on in the early 1900s, there was a court case where Ozawa was an individual from Japan and sued for citizenship, because at that time, individuals who weren't white weren't able to be citizens. And he went before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually said in their ruling at the time in the Ozawa case that only Caucasians are white and then therefore are able to be American citizens. So as a result, he was actually like he had a shop, his shop was taken from him as a result of this rule. Now in the Fend case, which was 3 months later, cases went to the Supreme Court a little faster back then, but so Fend, who had been a veteran, actually took his case and learned, because if you look at the science at the time, Fend identified as a Hindu, and so actually Hindu fit underneath the Caucasian in the description. And so then he said, well, in the Ozawa case, the Supreme Court said you could not be white without, or you have to be Caucasian to be white. So he argued he was Caucasian based on the science. And then in that case, the Supreme Court used very much the similar language that they kind of used with the pornography, idea of like, we know it when we see it. And it was like, well, the average white man knows what whiteness is. And so even though Fend had, in his words, like raised his family white and had like gone to Christian church and done these things he thought was, fitting, did not count. And so these definitions, though, of race oftentimes around whiteness, around Caucasian, they shift, they change, oftentimes to suit maintaining power for individuals. So That's one thing to look at. The other piece is this is more, folks who are your biologists and like zoologists and folks who are trying to categorize somewhat, looking at race around some of these different aspects. But it also plays out in our social sciences. So, right, we just finished 2020, which was a census year. And so the very first census in our country was done all the way back in 1790 and has been done every 10 years since. So I want to show you a couple things around census numbers that we have here in America. So this is just as you look at these different things, recognize that the way the census is counted, different groups of people, has changed oftentimes every 10 years. And so one of the things about trying to do science or trying to do sociology or some of these, census comparisons is how do you get a level understanding? So when we look at individuals in 1870, individuals who today would be Asian American, would be Chinese. 1980 was listed as other on the census, and 2000s as Asian. And the other thing that really comes out around this is that a number of individuals, like a number of surveys and tests today, use census classifications to say, like, we're not coming up with these racial terms, we're just using the census classifications. But we see kind of this shift. So around individuals today would be Black or African American. In 1850, slave was in the census. 1960, Negro was in the census. Now 1990, Black, and it's similar today. Indian, Eskimo, or Alaska Native, and this is all in the last 100 years. So we see just from 20 years. And so many people don't know, but Eskimo is considered a slur for many individuals. And so Alaska Native is a term. We see for individuals who are maybe Hispanic or Latinx, that Mexican was in 1920, this category. In 1950, they were considered white, and then in 1990, Hispanic white. And so those dynamics. And then since the beginning, 1790, it was free white, 1890 white, 2000 white. So white has been the one census category that has stayed consistent for all the census, for now 230 years, whatever, of censuses have stayed consistent. So also when we're measuring people, there's just a different baseline that we're comparing people against that is causing some of these aspects to kind of play out. So that's a little bit around some of that historical aspect around the census. Want to look at a couple examples around some specific things that have played out. So in America early on, there was kind of two main groups that were, one was a polygenesis group. And the polygenesis group was basically saying they justified slavery or justified the inequities by saying we're not all created equal. That Black people were descendants of Ham, and so Noah's son Ham, who went to Africa, that we're not all created equal. There is a difference between us. And then you have the monogenesis folks who say we're all created equal. It just happened that there was descendants of Adam and Eve. Some went to Europe, some went to Africa. In that, the monogenesis folks, just because we're all created equal, didn't actually assume everyone was equal. They just were like, we all started equal. But some of those that moved to Africa, maybe didn't get the education or the opportunity that others did. And so it was in a way that how these dynamics played out. This also started to play out early on in America, where the polygenesis and the monogenesis in a way start to become a dynamic of segregationists and assimilationists. And so the segregationists, they're very much like the polygenesis of that people are different. We need to be kept separate because there's a difference between people. And the assimilationists were much more no, we are all the same people. And so one of the early things that happened, so here's an example of an individual has vitiligo. And in this case, it's just a disease of the skin, or a dynamic that the skin starts to lighten. So what happened was is that there was early on when this was going on, some of the assimilationists, what they said was that individuals have dark skin because they came from Africa, which was closer to the equator. And then they were in the South of America, and when they were enslaved, and that was hotter. And so if we move them to the north, and they got into colder temperatures, their skin would actually turn white. And so there was early scientists who would find individuals who happened to be Black but had vitiligo, that they would tour around with them to show evidence that they could become white. And so these individuals, and like they, the people would thought this was an actual thing people could aspire to. And so like just some of this playing out is about how that early plays out. But if you think about it in a way, the segregationists, right, are saying like, we're totally separate and we're different and we can't be the same. And the assimilationists are saying, no, we're all the same. It's just the folks of color need to become more white. They need to change their skin color in order to fit in. So in both of those, they're still saying that folks, right, there's a group that is not equal or not able to be are equal until they change in some way. So that's where Ibram Kendi, many people know, if you've not seen, like this is one of his books, Stamped from the Beginning, which is a 500 some page book, packed with all the definitive history of racist ideas in America. I had the opportunity to see Ibram Kendi speak, and I would say like the first 5 questions people asked him were like, your book's really big. Is there a way you could make like a smaller version? And he's like, I apologize that the definitive history of racist ideas in America is not a short story. Like, I'm sorry that is not, I'm sorry that's not there. Like it, but if you were in the Cincinnati, if you have a Cincinnati library card, you can download it for free via audiobook and listen to it. And so I listened while walking Mobley and was able to really be able to like kind of go through it. But it was also, there's just a ton of stuff in there. But this is one of the things he talked about. But ultimately what he said in the book was really, when you think about these two dynamics of the segregationist and the assimilationist, that, right, like both of them are saying that there's something wrong with those folks. So those folks need to change in some, well, the one said they can change, the other said they're just fundamentally wrong, right? And so when we think about being an anti-racist, this is what Ibram Kendi talks about in terms of being anti-racist. How do we not consider anything as wrong with people, or really allow people to really understand that what is wrong is that structurally we have created systems that has not allowed people to be included, and as a result, we're seeing very different outcomes for individuals. And so in that way, so that's one of the ways the segregationists and assimilationists played out. But we know these dynamics played out in a number of other ways. And so there's another book called Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington. And this book by Harriet Washington really goes in depth to all of these, because many of these medical pieces were just, it was largely performing medical experimentation on Black individuals primarily without consent. It's really sad and unfortunate. So I don't want to dwell on it and spend a lot of time, but I do want to highlight a couple things just because I think it's important to note. So first, J. Marion Sims was known as the father of gynecology. And he got this title by actually conducting experiments on enslaved women in Alabama. And so this is an example. So here is one of, this is a picture. So we see this is J. Marion Sims. This is one of the women. You see the other women hiding behind. Like hiding behind the curtain there. But in many ways, there's a stereotype in science that Black people and Black women in particular don't feel pain at the same level. And so one of the examples that plays out around this is if anyone heard the story of Serena Williams, right? Serena Williams recently had a child a couple years ago, and she was in the hospital and told her nurse, I am having a blood clot right now. I had one previously because of an injury from playing tennis. I am having a blood clot and I need this test. And she was insistent, and the doctor was like, oh no, you're fine, and waved her off. And so in this case, Serena Williams kept insisting and finally got what she needed and did get medical intervention, but she could have died. There was a similar case, and this was actually of a doctor. I think it was in Indiana recently, but a similar case where she did not get the treatment because of that aspect. So I think those pieces play out, that continually doctors just discount pain from Black women. And so a lot of that comes from this. But this is a statue of J. Marion Sims that up until 2018 was in New York City. So finally there was a petition to remove it because of the horrendous scientific experiments Sims did on Black women. And this scientific experiments he were doing is in the 1840s. So a couple of things we need to note, right? This was 1840s in Alabama. So all of these women were enslaved. If they were enslaved women, they cannot give consent. So it was also, their master is basically, you know, because he was saying, I'm going to be able to find a way to make more children. So therefore there would be more slaves. And so masters were willing to give some of their enslaved women to him to run these experiments on. So, but in 2008, actually in 2017, there started to be a, have a seat. Started to be a Facebook petition that ultimately, since the New York City Council passed and Mayor at the time, Bill de Blasio, or he's still Mayor, but it's Bill de Blasio, ordered the removal. So that's Marion Sims. Similarly, in Alabama, we have the Tuskegee study. So just Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, like was the name of the study. Again, people were not told what they were getting treatment for. There was a number of things that played out that did not, that just was not really told to the participants in the study. As a result of this, though, 40 of the women who were married to the Tuskegee study, like, ended up also contracting syphilis, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. And so how those pieces play out. The next, how many people have read the book Henrietta Lacks, or the Life and Times of Henrietta Lacks? So some folks have on the call. So if you look at just the story of Henrietta Lacks, like, her cells have been in, I think, 11,000 different patents have been made because of her cells. And so much, and like, so the polio vaccine and all sorts of things have, can be traced back to Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cells. And so she basically had a biopsy. If you don't know her story, she had a biopsy, and they used cells from the biopsy in that they were able to culture them and start to grow cells in the lab. And so it's been used in so many things. And so when we really start to think about, like, Henrietta Lacks' story, the only reason her family found out was because after her death, scientists went and asked her family members if they could get her cells to continue the research. That was the only reason her family found out that it even happened, that her cells had been used. But if we think about an alternate story, right, where Henrietta Lacks was told, that she had cancer, she might not have survived, and would she be willing to donate, her body to science? And if there was a conversation about that and there had been trust involved and there was consent, and then you talk about 11,000 patents coming out of that, you could lift up her story and really have a powerful story about how people, and how scientific advancement happened, and how a Black woman being really at the center of that and really being able to change perceptions. But because consent wasn't given, then what has happened is now all of this becomes tainted in a way, because that chain didn't really get followed. Other things, there's human radiation experiments where, again, on Black people, radiation was tested, and within 2 months, many of them either had like severe cancers developing. There was a violence initiative. And so the violence initiative on Black children, this was just in the 80s and 90s. This was not very long ago. This was pretty recent. But what they did was they said they were going to do a study because they thought Black children were more violent than white children. White children were excluded from the study. White children were not allowed to be part of the study. So I don't know how you compare, but without any white children. White children weren't allowed to be part of the study. And then they went to families and just told them that they wanted to see if their children would be interested. Except what they didn't tell the families is that all of the children that they went to were younger siblings of children who were either in the juvenile or adult detention, like were in justice, like were already locked up in prison or incarcerated in some way. So they went to these younger siblings. Now, if you're a person who has a child already in jail that you're hoping will get out at some point and come back in, like, it also feels like you were somewhat, kind of forced to participate in that. There's the Baltimore Led Study, and more recently, we know things around like, Flint, Michigan, but were these kind of, in the Baltimore Led Study, though, they actually worked with landlords and like set up different apartments with different levels of like lead exposure to like see what happened. And a number of children develop learning disorders and other health aspects. But even more recently, with Flint, Michigan, where we just see that, there was just really a dereliction of duty, and now 7 years later, the former mayor of Flint, Michigan, or the former governor of Michigan, was charged with other government officials for that, but this plays out. And then the last piece on some medical pieces is sickle cell disease versus cystic fibrosis. So sickle cell disease actually affects 3 times the number of people as cystic fibrosis, except by and large, sickle cell disease is much more prevalent in individuals who happen to be Black. Cystic fibrosis is much more prevalent in individuals who happen to be white. And funding for sickle cell disease is, even though it's 3 times as many individuals who are diagnosed, funding from government grants, and this is all NIH, government grants is, a third of what is given to cystic fibrosis. And there was 10 centers in the country that were able to treat sickle cell disease, and all of those were unfunded in the mid 2000s. So we just have this aspect where cystic fibrosis continues to be more researched. So we're seeing all of these things happen over the course of this history. And as we get to today, where we looked at the beginning about where in the middle of a pandemic that has unfortunately and tragically killed 500,000 people in our country. And the best way for us to get back to some level of normalcy, just to have some of these meetings in person and to see some of these wonderful people over coffee, is for vaccines. And even then, there's strands and things that could cause even complications with the vaccine, but have that aspect. But because of this history, there is such a high distrust of the medical profession and the individuals of engaging in this. And so I think that's one of the things that has to be a really honest conversation, is not just that we need the vaccine, but we need people to understand that the vaccine is safe. So just calling something Operation Warp Speed doesn't always give people confidence that things are safe. Like we need more ability to really meet with people, meet where they are. We also need culturally competent aspects. We need individuals who themselves are Black or representing the communities, talking to community members to be able to have these things. And so all of that leads us, we need more individuals who are able to be in positions of health and medical and more access to those things. Now, I want to end with, we talked a lot about all this. Now, what do we do with all this? So I want to end with actually a little bit of an activity for us to just think about in ourselves. So for this, I want to ask you if you're willing to come off mute and do a little ending activity with us. You see on the screen a number of different colors. These words are in different colors. So all you are doing is just across the top row, you are going to say the color that the word is in. So you would say, like, for the first row, like red, orange, purple. That's all you're doing.
Yeah.
It's just this piece. So
This is very difficult.
it is very difficult. So
I'll try.
progress, but this is where we're starting. We give people a win early on, Peter. So all right, so all you're doing is just across. You're just going to go row by row to say the 15 words. So
should I go truck piece of gloves or what?
No, you
Or
say
a
red,
dog.
orange, purple.
Oh, red, orange, purple, blue, green, red. I guess that's purple, red, green, green, purple,
Wrong already.
car.
Wrong already.
Orange.
Oh, is everybody doing it? I thought we were doing one at a time.
Everyone can do it. Everyone can do it.
Okay.
It becomes a little bit of a cacophony on Zoom. Zoom doesn't handle sounds at the same time,
Okay.
but yes.
Peter, you got the sixth one wrong. You got 5 right and the sixth one wrong. And then you started going off the rails.
Yeah. So,
Oh,
some of the colors show up differently on people's devices sometimes, I find. But so again,
thanks,
we're going
Sean.
to do it one more time. So again, I'm going to change the slide. I'm just going to ask you again, say the color that the word is in.
And I know what's happening here now. Yep. Are we all going to do it together? Oh,
Sure, do it together.
Really hard. This
together.
one-
Red, orange, blue, green, red, and red.
Orange. Red. Orange.
Red.
Red,
Purple.
red, purple, blue, green,
Black.
blue, red.
Red, blue, orange, green, red, orange.
Blue. Brown.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Chartreuse.
yeah. When you
Lavender.
compare when you compare these two, like this first one versus the second one,
Very difficult.
what did you notice in the second one?
You read the word, not the speak the color.
Yeah.
The verbal is stronger than the visual.
There you go. John's put it perfectly.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the master and the emissary, isn't it? The left and right brains.
We are reading is like second nature. You can't stop it. You're going to do it. It's
Yeah.
automatic. It's driven in.
And so this one, you could glance at the word and easily say the color. This time though, you glanced at the word and then you'd have to take a minute to really process.
Not a minute.
And maybe a second, like a second to really like discern or take that in. And I think, but that's one of the things that we just want to recognize as we look at this history, right? That we also want to acknowledge that each of us, there's identities we have that we maybe are more proximate to or more comfortable and have those preferences. There's also times where we have to just takes us maybe a little bit more time, a little bit more intentionality to meet with people across lines of difference. And so this is just giving us that idea of sometimes, right, our brains take in 11 million things a second, but we don't always get in those 11 million messages a second. We don't process everything. It takes us a little bit of time. So just recognizing with this history that we've talked about today, a lot of times we've not necessarily in history taken that time to really think thoughtfully and intentionally about other people. So I just wanted to end with this kind of activity to help us say like what can be done. And this is a very simple step to just start saying we have to be intentional. We have to act with a little bit more purpose in our interactions if we really want to start seeing change happen. One, we have to just acknowledge that this history has happened. And in many ways it's tragic and harmful and hurt a lot of communities. And in some ways, some of this history is still happening today. So it's not always just in the past, it's still things that are happening today. But what's the best thing we can do is one, is just start thinking about our actions. And then once we do that, then thinking about how do we act in a way that hopefully, back to our James Baldwin quote at the beginning, really takes others into account and unlocks our ability to really be able to engage with different people. So that's our presentation for today. I know I'll pass it back to Mandy, but I know we kind of take a little bit of a moment to take a breather and then come back for some Q&A and discussion.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you,
A round of
Sean.
applause. Yes.
Very good.
Thank you.
Oh, can I say something, Mandy? There's a little question about whether we, in the past, have recorded the Q&A period. We always have. I don't know where we got the idea that we didn't, If anybody has any problem with being recorded in the Q&A, tell me now, and maybe we won't, but understand that you are being recorded and will be on our website. If you have objections, let me know. No objections? Do it.
Also, sometimes if you're not sure how to word or frame your question, you can always put the question in the chat, and then
Yes.
we can just read it in that way. That maybe.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you. That's good.
Definitely, definitely. So yeah, if you want to put it in chat, you can do that as well. So just to kind of, we'll go back to Q&A here in a moment, but just did want to let everyone know, next month we do have Dee Chavez, who is a registered nurse, and Dr. Jean Corwin. They'll be talking about single payer healthcare, nationally and locally. So that'll be next month on there. So I think that's all I had. So we can go ahead to Q&A. Bill, did you have a
Yeah,
comment? Or?
yeah, I wasn't waving goodbye. So Sean,
Yeah.
Science is a powerful thing, and especially for the non-religious humanists, secular humanists, we value science, but throughout, even if science is getting a bad rap from certain parts of the population, it's still very persuasive, and it does control a lot of how we think and what we do. So what do you think would be the most important things that could happen from a scientific point of view in the next 10 years to finally get us off this bus?
Yeah, great question, Bill. So a couple things I think that come to mind is one, early on in the pandemic, many hospitals and health centers still were not collecting race. Now, there's a way that we can just say race is a social construct. Why would we collect it at all? But as the CDC chart noted, like we know there's disparities. And so I think sometimes we just have to like be intentional about collecting data and like having those things. And so I think right now, a lot of places just don't even think to ask or don't even collect that information. And then that continues to, we're not sure what we're trying to solve for in that sense. We don't have that information. And so I think when we think about science, many of us as secular humanists or atheists, like what we appreciate about science is its ability to update itself, or ability to kind of, self-evaluate over time, or, and we have those things. And so the goal really of science is that we shouldn't be, right, like we shouldn't be telling science what to think, right? Like science should be challenging us to think. But a lot of times in history, there's been a number of people who I think have gone out trying to prove what they wanted. So if you look at, for instance, like in America in the second half of the 1800s, actually throughout the 1800s, you can find research papers pretty much about every part of the black body being compared to the white body. And so it would be like the white shoulder clavicle compared to the black clavicle, and there would be some way of saying the white one was superior. Now, all of this comes to a head right in the 1936 Olympics, where Jesse Owens in Berlin wins 4 gold medals in front of Hitler and the Nazis. How do you explain that Jesse Owens is able to do this?
Well, even a little earlier with Joe Louis and Max Schmeling, but yeah.
But they have to come up with some explanation for this. So what they said was that Jesse Owens was closer to being a savage and needed quickness to escape in the wilderness. So this was the way they were able to justify it. Now, again, there's no science there. And so that's the thing I think that we just have to recognize is, right, like today, when any public policy debate happens, everybody can find their scientist who, like, right, you can find a scientist that says masks are ineffective. Like, because somebody's going to take some money for some reason or whatever. So everyone's going to find something, but it's also like 98% of scientists are saying this. So there seems to be a by and large consensus. And so I think that's the piece we just really have to look at with science, is just recognizing what is the what is the rigorousness? Was it really produced with fidelity? All of those things that we really think about the scientific method were those at play. And that's how we can be assured that we're following something. And even then, when we do all those things, sometimes new information comes along that challenges our thinking and we have to update. And so I think that's also has to be our ability, is to grow and change with the times and not be led to past beliefs. Go ahead.
Can I follow up on that? Because here's kind of where I'm going. I know that, you know, race is a social construct. It's not a scientific construct.
I'll do 7. I'll do 7. Okay, cool. I'll do 8 since I haven't gone, and then
Someone needs to mute.
I know, I'll find them.
That was me. That was me. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, Kyle, thanks. I know that, for instance, 2 years ago, the French police stopped identifying suspects as black or white or any color. The most that they will do now is light or dark, just as a sort of visual way to have a gesundheit, to have an idea of you know, who it may have been. And since we know that race scientifically, you know, it only makes sense in terms of a human race. It doesn't really make any other kind of sense. Do you look, even though you said it's important that we keep track of what we currently call race in terms of things like how COVID-19 is affecting people, do you think it would be valuable in the very near future if we stopped identifying people by race?
I would say it depends, I think, on the context, because there's sometimes where people just are like, can we just stop talking about race? Like, we're always talking about race and just want to get over it without actually resolving, right? So yesterday was the anniversary of Malcolm X's assassination and death. And so he has a famous quote, right, where he was like, if I have a knife 9 inches in your back and I pull it out 6 inches, I don't say, right, they're like, let's start the healing. The healing doesn't start until the knife is out, and I apologize for what has happened, and we move forward. And so I think there's a dynamic where sometimes people want to stop talking about race because they want to stop feeling bad, right? Like, white people just want to stop feeling guilty about what's happened in the past. Like, I wasn't there, I didn't cause it. But I think it's that broader aspect where that is. Now, I think also what we have to look at is, right, like 1 in 20 years, like, and actually Cincinnati is projected to be 4 years ahead of like the national curve, but about 20 years is when our country is supposed to be majority minority, like so individuals non-white would make up the majority of our country. And also we see probably the next probably the next, you know, like couple generations, as we see more and more individuals of different skin colors marrying, we're going to see more and more dynamics that where we're going to see some of that race, you know, just in terms of skin color play out, or like kind of like phase out of that. So I think in time, but I think at this point, just because there's such a history, and we've never really, I think in America, right, we've never apologized really and done anything around reparations for slavery or any of the things that have happened like in a meaningful way to really bring about the equity. And so to just say we want to stop talking about race, you know, I think in a way, I think in police reports, I think there's a different dynamic because, you know, I think like policing, if you're not familiar, policing in our country started because of slave patrols. Like that is where policing really started and has its history rooted in that. And so I think there's, you know, been these dynamics that play out.
Yeah, I think, you know, with you, Bill, you mentioned how they report it, like on the news and that sort of thing, how it's talked about more. I think that could have some benefit. But as far as documentation, you would still want that documentation right now because, yeah, there's still so many issues across so many different categories that we need to know that data so that we can look at, is it improving? Is it worsening? What areas do we need to fix? You know, which is like all of them, but you know, to notice those trends and to have that data.
Well, I think we could still talk about ethnicity, but I think we should get rid of the concept of race. It's a construct whose time is overdue disappearing, in my opinion.
It looks like, by the way, folks, you have a reaction button, some of you, lower right. I'm raising my hand, and Ruth's iPad was raising her hand. And so, Mandy, you can use that hand raising to start calling on people, or you can actually raise your hand if you can't find the button. I think I raised first, and I just wanted to add to Bill's. I drove school buses for a while, and the dispatcher who had dark skin, when it was important if there was a child not picked up or somebody had to be found or to describe that child as best they could. 7 years old, first grade, 8th grade. But when it came to skin color, they never said black or white. The dispatcher or anybody on the mics, you learned the lingo, and it was always, there's a little boy named Bobby, 2nd grade, at the corner of such and such. He's got a red hat on, he's got dark skin, and he goes blah, blah, blah. And it stuck with me, and I think that's a way, especially when I heard the lady in Kroger run into the store and say, a black man just stole somebody's car. And I said, if it was a white man, would you run in and say, a white man just stole somebody's car? When you're trying to find a suspect, you can say this color of his skin, but you don't have to refer to people as black or white. That makes them sound like a different kind of person. If it's red hair or dark skin, blue jacket, it's just a feature. That's the end of mine.
All right, Ruth, you had one? Oh, you're still muted.
Did I misunderstand? I thought that you said there were no genetic markers for race in humans.
There are no genetic markers.
So
Go ahead, yeah.
So how can you know if you're of a certain race or not?
Indeed.
You're human.
Because someone has
there is no
decided
race.
to monetize it, 23andMe has decided to monetize it. But I think like more so what comes out around that is like you can do testing. You can like do your like mitochondrial DNA like testing and have and it could kind of tell you from like what regions might you be. Now there are some certain things, right? Like so like the example I gave around sickle cell versus cystic fibrosis. So sickle cell is generally in Black individuals and cystic fibrosis is generally in white individuals. Now this doesn't mean that like that is playing out along skin color. More often that's an aspect of evolution that's coming from where people are from. Like malaria is another place that kind of plays out around that when we look at like different communities. And so oftentimes it's based on your geographics. So that ethnicity piece of like where we're from geographically does play out oftentimes. And so those I think are important sometimes medically to understand as we're working on, in different health fields about how we're trying to give people appropriate care or care that best, maybe suits what they need. But I think there's no, basically what like biological like scientists would kind of say is that there's no characteristic that is found in all people of one skin color that cannot be found in any other skin color. So I think that's where we see it's not necessarily biological in race.
That's clear.
Anybody else? Okay.
Kyle?
Okay.
I just put a comment in the box saying that I just was taking my hand down because I felt like Shawn covered what I would have hoped to cover and what I would have said. While I do have some sympathy for the ideas that I think Bill is mirroring, which are that there's a necessary component of moving on to not so that assimilation can happen as opposed to an extra stressing of differences. But again, like the example was brought out, there has to be some reconciliation first, and life has to come all the way out. So while I don't have a solution for any of the comments or questions raised, I just wanted to speak to them. But I think anything meaningful that I would have added has already been said. So thanks.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you for sharing.
Matt, I'm sorry.
Matt's hand. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Matt.
Hello, I'm Matt. How you guys doing?
Doing well, how are you?
Good. So this might not pertain much to your talk, but one of the issues that I have today is how we keep talking about slavery in the past tense. How do we rectify it, talking about slavery in a modern sense, especially now there's more slaves in the world today than ever before, and they're not necessarily a darker skin color, it could be any color. But like in our Anglo-Saxon European mentality, we don't talk about slavery in a modern sense. How do we rectify that?
Yeah, so great question, Matt. And so I think, you know, when we talk about modern day slavery in that aspect, I think one distinction that is important to pull out is when we think about chattel slavery in terms of like there just being law that like there was a certain group of people were property and there was no way to change that. Like that is chattel slavery in our history. I think today for modern slavery, there are a number of people who, whether it be sex trafficking, whether it be like, you know, locked in, like, you know, work contracts or different things that it does play out. And actually the Freedom Center downtown, if anyone gets a chance, the Freedom Center has a modern day slavery exhibit that kind of looks at and highlights some of these pieces. And I think right here in Cincinnati, I-75 that goes through Cincinnati is in many ways one of the main kind of thoroughfares of modern day slavery.
Yes.
So from Florida up to Michigan, like this 75 like has a number of individuals who are being trafficked. And so there's a lot of individuals, I think right now, the modern day slavery, I think oftentimes comes out because just like we were talking about in the beginning around some of the historical inequities, that there are still inequities playing out. Oftentimes, I mean, there's domestic inequities, but there's also a lot of inequities just going out globally. That like people are trying to find a better way for their family. And so are trying to, and sometimes get caught up in trying to come to America or go to other countries and get caught up and unfortunately can be trafficked or abused in ways. And so I think we just need to acknowledge that it is still happening. And I think as you rightly pointed out, it's not necessarily set up in a legal way. This is definitely happening, at least in America, it's happening under the radar, you know, and so there are efforts to try and end those, but it's still definitely an issue that's still playing out that impacts disproportionately people of color, immigrants, and vulnerable populations. And so I think those are things we just have to continue to raise up. I think that the history of enslavement in this country oftentimes is around that chart I showed earlier where it was the graph, you know, of the red line, but that was where it was illegal slavery. Since the Emancipation Proclamation, it has now been an illegal slavery, but it still exists.
Yeah. From what I understand, I thought some forms of sex trafficking and sex slavery are actually legal in parts of Southeast Asia now.
In different countries, yeah. Like I'm not as familiar with those policies or laws as I am in just American history and some of that. But I think there are definitely places where if it's not legal, there's definitely a look the other way dynamic that can cause people to get caught up in that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else have a question or?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have to say for a topic like this, and I'm not complaining but for a topic that can be so flammable, in certain discussions. I have to be curious and ask, is this a group where it's mostly educational and everyone's just looking to listen, or is this a group where everyone's somewhat socially, not politically, but socially inclined towards, like, progression of humanity? I've just never been in a conversation where it was this peaceful. And again, while I'm not, I find myself needing to reholster comments that don't need to come out, which is a delightful place to find myself in. But I don't want to do the disservice of offering any useful perspective that I don't think I'm any more uniquely well positioned to have than any of you guys, but it has been useful in some conversations. So how are you, most of you guys regulars, I guess is what I'm asking shortly.
Yeah, I'd say most people here are regulars. We have some newer people. We do tend to be more progressive, and with humanism, these are thoughts that we work on and think about trying to improve and work on some of these inequalities and issues there. So that's kind of my perspective. Anyone else have a?
Well, if you want to see fights, come to the board meeting. No, it's not that
Heated
bad.
debates sometimes. Yes.
We have a social meeting too. The first Monday, right, Mandy?
Yeah.
We just get together and chew the fat, so to speak. And actually, the first one was focused on our New Year's. What each of us needs as help. And for example, we met a cartoonist who wanted to draw more. Less from reality and in more of imagination. And John, I led him to, oh damn it, hold on, I forget his name. But anyway, I gave him two art directors, two graphic designers, and so everybody needs a little help here and there, and we're trying to help each other on that kind of meeting. That's a very social, family-like kind of meeting.
Well, I think it's fair to say that this particular topic has attracted somewhere in the neighborhood of a third people who have not been regular.
Yeah.
Which is
including myself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm very grateful to have landed here and met you guys.
Oh, good.
I think what Matt said, the reason I might have felt the button pushed of why haven't you had something else to say yet? I think Matt's remark was such a great segue into somewhere where we began to go, and out of somewhere that I'm used to coming in a lot of other conversations in which the implications of slavery, which obviously we just had a great portion of the lecture, if you will, dedicated to it. And I think that a lot of times, as it was brought out in I think maybe two comments before mine, the difficulty in the situation begins to arise at a certain point, and because of a certain cause. One of the causes is that people who you want to be in this conversation often know this conversation. So people who are inclined to be here are often, I don't want to say it's a self-serving circle, but we kind of all know that we're working from a place of goodwill. And trying to get on an equal playing field that Shawn illustrated in some of the earliest of the pictures is difficult. And I think the difficulty usually arises when our inability to hear or our unwillingness to hear other people and attribute the decency to them to have a maybe different perspective may push some of us out. So some people hear the word reparations, for example, and they go ballistic. I hear the word reparations the same way I hear the word God. What do you mean? Like it deserves some follow-up questions. So I would love to hear more from Matt if he decides to like pursue that road, which he wasn't talking about reparations. He was just talking about the implications and like how to maybe create a view on how to look at slavery in a way that when I listen to news on one side of the political spectrum, it tends to go straight to Libya, and it tends to distance, American slavery. And I think I have a lot of friends on the other side who haven't yet found a comfortable space, to say what I'm about to say, which I have to include my bias here. I'm someone who was a product of that policing system. I'm someone who was arrested at 16 and charged as an adult and grew up in adult prison. And I'm in my early 30s now, but I don't have a formal education, so I don't have the words to say any of this very eloquently. But it's impossible to not notice that, at least in the southeastern region, outside of slavery, that Medicare, single-payer Medicare for all, is not the most critical issue to racial equity. We're never going to get checks, but there does have to be some platform in which we say, okay, we're not going to maybe we don't put cash in your hand, which wouldn't necessarily be right, because the white guy who's as poor as me or the one who's way richer has no more guilt in the sin of slavery than I do. However, when we're talking about equalizing the playing field and making it so that the most critical threats to someone's capacity to live stably and raise children safely, if they're like me and you're never going to get a high paying job with 401k or something, if you know you're going to be doing physical labor, then you do yearn for some potential ideas that I think have been generally shunned by even people that are politically aligned with me. Thanks for listening. I know that was long-winded.
Sorry.
Well, I want to say something though. You are very well spoken, so don't sell yourself short on that. I really enjoyed listening to what you had to say, and you're well spoken.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Yeah, reparation is.
Agreed.
Yeah. To go to the subject, it's like defunding the police. They didn't really mean to take all the money away from all the cops, and reparations. Really, the word takes you immediately to give people money, and that's going to fix it. No, you're right. Reparation has to be well thought out along the lines of affirmative action, and whatever needs to be done.
Yeah,
The
there's
difficult
I mean,
thing
I
with
think one of the, sorry, man, as I say, like one thing on that too is that I think to raise this up, like Kyle kind of asked about like our group being more, like level in this conversation than some that is like our name is the Free Inquiry Group. So our hope is that we're willing to have free inquiry about things. Now, I do want to say for the record that back in the day when I was program chair, I asked a former, a past member of FIG, who I will no longer name, to do a presentation about gun control. And instead, he just brought his collection of guns to the hotel. And and when I said, like,
we know
do
who you're
you want
talking
to talk about gun control? And he was like, no, people are going to argue about that. And I was like, but we're the Free Inquiry Group. So usually we are willing to engage. That was maybe one of the few exceptions, but I think willing to talk. But I think the piece around reparations, though, is that important is one, I had the chance to see a really great presentation. I'm putting the book in the chat if people are interested. But it was William Darity and there you go. William Darity and as like a new book around doing reparations, but it was like one of the things that oftentimes come up, that the word, and I think Peter, you know this, if the word like reparations comes up, like white people want to be like, well, what about it? Like, I'm okay with it maybe in this case, but not in this case. And white people want to automatically start putting qualifiers on it. And I think just with our history, like that's been something we try to do. So I think Kyle's question is fantastic about, like, what do you mean by that? And allowing people when they say, or even defund the police, or when people say different things, I just think those three powerful words of tell me more, and allowing someone to talk really helps us get to understanding as opposed to jumping to conclusions. And so that's the other piece, I think, of that activity we did.
Well, that quote about that you got from Baldwin about the knife and pulling it out partway nobody's
from
gonna,
Malcolm.
sorry, from
I think
Malcolm,
so.
you're right.
I could be
You're
right.
right. And nobody's going to turn around with the knife halfway out and say, thanks, we're even now. You know, even after the knife comes out, there's healing that has to happen. And reparations, to me, I've always heard that word repair inside of reparations, which is what it really means. It doesn't automatically mean that money repairs everything. You know, there's all kinds of levels of reparations that have to be engaged in. And again, I'll return to this old one. Remember when before we started, somebody was talking about Charlie Rose? And if anybody ever gets a chance to see Charlie Rose interviewing Maya Angelou, shortly after, or not long after Caged Bird came out, I know why the Caged Bird sings. And she was telling him about the first time she ever met a white person and how she thought white people must be dead. You know, they must be like zombies or something because they don't have any color and they don't smile at her and they have no emotion and, you know, they're obviously dead people. And Charlie, being, I think, from North Carolina or someplace, couldn't get it. He said, what do you mean they're dead? I mean, he couldn't put himself in her shoes. And that's difficult. They're a lot smaller than her. She was a 6-year-old girl, a 6-year-old African-American girl. He's an adult white person. But, you know, but I was listening to her and tears were coming down my eyes because I felt what it was like to stand in her shoes in that general store the first time her mom sent her to get something from a white-owned store, and there were white people in it. And she was just trying really, really hard to figure out what they are. And it was really good to be on the other side of that coin, you know. And
Thank you.
that was a bit of an excursion there, but
Well, as you were sharing that, and just real quick, like, wanted to highlight, if folks have never seen this before, and I'll put the link in the chat to it as well, but there's a summary of like racial identity development. And so there's a couple of different theories, but it's that aspect, I think, around how this can happen. And so this integrated model kind of looks around like, what is the experience? And so I think sometimes there can be an aspect here around retreat. And so for white people, right, like sometimes there's a conformity, we just don't really know about race. And then it's like, what does it look like? And so, right, and there's this aspect of retreat right here that I want to pull out, and it's that white people, sometimes when they're moving along their own racial identity model, can get frustrated, annoyed, or impatient with other whites who don't get it. And there's a dynamic around that playing out. And I think, and similarly on the immersion side of the folks of color like Liz, is that sometimes there can be a desire just to kind of like surround themselves with other people of color, other people who get it, because there's that protection, you know, aspect. And I think for both of us that plays out. And so I think just as you were talking about that, recognizing that's oftentimes what's going on too when we have difficulty talking to someone about race, is that they're maybe at a very different developmental level than we are. Mm-hmm. And so we're just talking, it's similar, right, to like believers and non-believers, right? Like we're just talking on different planes. They're talking about faith, we're talking about evidence, and like we're just going to miss each other continually. And so I think that's one of the things that just continues to happen. And so I think that's always where when someone's saying something that just doesn't gel with what our thought is, that's where it's always tell me more, allowing people to talk, or just to sometimes share that's not been my experience. I think that's the other really powerful piece, is that we might not change the person's mind we're talking to, but somebody else in the room maybe hears a new idea for the first time, or the person we're talking to hears a new idea for the first time, and it possibly plants a seed. Mm-hmm. And I think so often we're used to just being on the internet and arguing with people. And just by a show of hands, how many of you have like had an argument with someone on the internet and you just magically changed their mind and they just came to your side and said, you know what, you made some really excellent points. I'm going to stop my hate tweeting, you know, and just kind of come over and join your side.
The most you can hope for is that you stop hearing from them.
Right. So
Or
rarely,
the people
rarely
that-
do we, yeah,
Yeah.
rarely do we make that much progress, oftentimes because we lack a relationship with people.
Mhm.
I think, and that's an aspect of just saying, like, if this is ultimately about how are we increasing humanity, if the goal to like make people be more comfortable with science or more comfortable with vaccines or more comfortable with scientific advancement or just more comfortable with one another, whatever our goal is, just if we're able to just see people's humanity and allow them a space, I think that's really going to be what causes us to see the change we want to see.
And yeah, and I think too, when we bring up the topics of race, it can be a lot like religion as well. When we talk about being non-religious, is that if you say something, if someone says something and you're like, well, what you said was racist or that's racist, they take it as an identity, saying that they're a racist, horrible person. They're not separating that one behavior from their full identity. And so they'll get very defensive about it. And similar to when some of us will talk about atheism with religious people, because they see it as somewhat as an attack on their religion that someone else doesn't believe. And that's their religion is a big part of their identity. And so they can get very defensive very quickly. So that's something too, as we look at talking with people with different perspectives, is to be aware of that. And that can be difficult when we're used to talking in groups that are more aware of these topics and more progressive. Just even talking about how I feel about some of these topics, I've gotten a lot of pushback from that. I know Peter had mentioned like defund the police and reparations gets a big reaction. And sometimes that's part of it, is that concern about, well, I'm not racist, and why do I have to do this, So that's something to kind of keep in mind, to have better conversations with people as we go outside of our bubbles. Yeah, Peter?
To follow up to whoever, Shawn, I took to heart Biden's inaugural and actually did what he asked, and it's what you asked too. I've been arguing with my friends. I have high school friends. We get together, and they're way back in the woods. And so I just said to one of the most aggressive Trumpsters, okay, tell me. I'll listen. I'm not going to argue with you. I'll listen. And he gave me his whole reason why he supported Trump. And hoping for the next time we talk, he's going to, now he trusts me. Now he knows I'll listen. Another fellow who has moved along quite a way, much, further along, said, yeah, I go along with everything, but every time you see a commercial, it's a black and white couple. And my question was simply, why does that bother you? And I think that's like a seed. I'm not going to answer it for him. I'm not going to say, there's, well, as for advertisers, John, we always try to represent the world the way it was. And in Chicago, New York, and LA, there's a lot of interracial couples, and advertisers want to speak to them. Why? I didn't explain all that. I just said, why does that make you uncomfortable? And that's a seed, I think. I hope, and we'll know in the weeks that come if I'm starting to move. But you have to plant. You have to get on common ground, and that's the first step, is listening to them. They think we think they're stupid, and well, I'm not going to argue with that. But they don't want to be thought of as stupid, and they hold those things very dear. And you got to listen.
Yeah, there's a lot of, thank you for that, Peter. And I think there's a lot of fear. And we want to make sure we're not centering that fear to the exclusion of other identities, but also just acknowledging that I think they're afraid about a changing world and they don't know their place in it. Mm-hmm. And I think for so long, whiteness was centered and they knew their place in it. They knew they were lifted up and given a better position just because of the color of their skin, and that's going away. And that's ultimately what's going on with individuals. And so there's a way of just saying, like, sometimes I can just be like, well, like, you know, it's gonna be, but also recognizing that, like, with me, I'm willing to listen, but like, what do they do to other people I love who are people of color or LGBTQ when they're not around me? And so that's also sometimes where I think about, what does it look like if we have that capacity to engage in those real conversations, so that we're trying to stop some of that trauma from other vulnerable groups maybe having to experience that fear.
Mm-hmm. Good.
I thought I saw Ginny with a question. I could be wrong. Did I? No? Okay.
She just made a comment. One thing I want to share is that if you want to know more in depth about some of the different studies and things, I didn't want to go super in depth because I think it is difficult history, but I put in the Dr. Ndidi Inaka, who's at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. She gave a fantastic talk in back in August around reflections on racism in medicine. And so it's about 1 hour. It's free on YouTube. So I put the link in the chat. If you want to know more about some of that history, if that is something you'd like to explore, you could also look at the medical apartheid book. Like those are two resources.
I have to follow that. I'll tell you that I write a report about the event. I don't say too much about a whole lot about what you said because the video is available if you want to see what, you know, rehear or tell your friends about it or pass it on. It's in a video. But I also will give you links to all the books that have been mentioned. And before this meeting, as a matter of fact, Bill Messer led us to a video, How Do We End Racism in Policing? That video will be in there. And but to get that report, you have to be on our list. So go to the homepage and just, you know, no, you don't have to pay dues. We really like you to. But on the homepage, there's a keep me informed. You know, I'm going to subscribe. Subscribe, you'll know about every visit, every topic that's coming up, and you'll get the links to the things we talked about and that kind of stuff.
Here, can I make a recommendation?
Yeah.
This is just doing our part to try and save the world, but there's a fantastic resource if you want to look for books, bookshop.org, which is basically a website that pulls together all independent booksellers. So by and large, I think I do it too. Like just when I go look for books, the first one that usually pops up is Amazon, and it's just my default. I'm trying to give Jeff Bezos less money and trying to give more to independent booksellers and things, especially when buying books that I think are around race and around social justice topics and really trying to benefit progressive bookstores. So if you go to bookshop.org, typically it's the same price or maybe about $1 or $2 more than what it is for Amazon, but you can find all the books that you want to look there. So if you can maybe use Bookshop for the links just to promote independent booksellers.
Yeah, we were just talking about having an Amazon, being an Amazon vendor. So when we announce books, you buy them, Fig gets a nickel. But I agree with you, not making Jeff Bezos any. I wonder if bookshop.org has a vendor affiliate relationship. I'd rather go there.
Yeah, check it out.
I thought Jeff Bezos was leaving Amazon.
He is leaving. He's still going to have a whole lot of stock and benefit from the company. He's stepping down from his board.
Yeah, he's in a different role.
Bill has a question.
Yep.
I have a question from your talk. Do you differentiate between being racist and racism? Because you defined racism essentially as
power,
as a white power, not white power, but a white power construction. And yet I've encountered Black people who are flat out racists. And I mean, I worked on a board where the chairman of the board was a Black person who virulently hated white people. And it was very difficult to talk to him.
Yeah. So there's a fantastic book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. And basically when Dr. Joy DeGruy was in grad school, she was asked by a professor, what are reasons people have post-traumatic stress syndrome? And people mentioned, like war, natural disasters, abuse, different things that people experience. And so she was the only person in her grad school class who was Black, and she said slavery. And the professor said, you can't have post-traumatic slave syndrome from, or you can't have post-traumatic stress syndrome from being Black or from slavery because you didn't experience it. Now, there's a whole line of study about epigenetics and about the way the impact of slavery and stress can still impact people. But you can have that. But anyway, so Dr. Joy, to prove this professor wrong, went and wrote her dissertation and created a great book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Basically was like, I'm going to show you what it is. But she does this great thing when I've seen her speak live a couple times, and she does this great thing when she speaks live. And she basically was like, if I am a racist white person against Blacks or other folks of color, my racism can cause Black people or people of color, like, what are the things I could impact? And she has people from the audience shout out different things, right? That I could, depending on my position, it could be about housing or health or education. I could limit their experiences in all these areas, right? Because there is a historical power there. And she was like, now flip side, if I'm a Black person, she's like, and I could be a Black person, like, I hate white people all day long, up and down. Like, what can I do to really change the experience of white people in this country? And she's like, it can be fear, it can be anger, but there's not the power. And so that bias and prejudice exists, but there's not necessarily the positional power as we would think historically in this country. It doesn't mean Black people are not powerful in their own right, but it just means historically that power to really affect large scale systems hasn't necessarily been there along lines of race. Now, that's the way historically it's talked about. And I would say Ibram Kendi, who wrote a book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Ibram Kendi, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he would say we all can be racist and we all can be anti-racist. So because all of us can have prejudice about another group, and that prejudice can limit somebody's choices, opportunities, and access. So I'm probably a little bit more aligned with the Ibram Kendi side, because I think power and access is shifting a little bit. I still think, though, historically, that like there is more structure there. So that's where I think, like, when we use that example, though, I think it's more centering that historically decision making and power and advantage has largely been determined based on skin color and largely been assigned to whites in our society. And so
is that because you're talking about America society? I mean, because when the
definitely. If you look at other countries, like in Brazil, they have 87 words for Black, and so race is so different. Every country you'd look at would be totally different.
The Hutus and the Hutsis, and Black on Black, and you can find Barack Obama affected my life, not in a negative way, but so it's shifting. And what you're talking about a very specific thing, American race, institutionalized racism.
American institutional racism, is the where that definition is like centered and focused on.
And my friend who makes a racist comment, I can call her a racist, even though
you can. But I would say, like, from my work with Camp Quest and other youth serving organizations, if a child misbehaves and you tell a child they're bad, then the child can internalize that. Versus, if you tell a child that that action you took maybe wasn't very nice or wasn't very safe, then we focus on the action. And we leave room for growth. So I know when people say things that are racist, we don't want to redeem them, because sometimes we get just really angry at people. But there's an aspect of saying what you just said, might be hurtful, or I prefer not to be around it, right? So like I said earlier, I worked at the Holocaust Center. So Warner Koppel, who was a local Holocaust survivor, Warner would end every one of his talks when he went out and talked in public. And he said, he's like, I lived through 4 years in a concentration camp at Auschwitz. He's like, I've seen these things. And he's like, so people say things around me, and they say things like Jew them down or Indian giver, these terms that are just really rooted in a lot of ignorance. And what he says is like, I've experienced hate and discrimination, and I don't want to experience anymore. So I'd appreciate if you don't say that around me. So that was like a simple way of just saying that was like, you can choose what you want to do, because I'm not in control of you, but around me, I'd prefer if you didn't say those things. So I think that's where, instead of calling someone racist, if we just say like, I'd appreciate if you don't say that around me, maybe gets them to think about their things as opposed to just shutting down and saying, I'm not a racist, then I have, and then they start listing all the reasons they're not a racist, which are more problematic and more racist than their probably original statement, which we don't want to like bring up or expose ourselves to. So that's the
Additionally, Sean, you know, we have this tendency to make things no puns intended, black and white, tend to polarize thing or make them binary, and it's either all of this or all of that.
Yeah.
You know, I'm completely aware, having grown up white in a essentially racist society, that I have racism in me, you know, but I'm also not a racist. And, you know, so, and I work all the time to eliminate, reduce the amount of racism that's in me. But, you know, but I'm a long way from being, you know, a racist in the sense that you're talking about. And so
No,
I think it'd be very helpful if people are willing to acknowledge that they've inculcated racism by the product of living in a racist society and having to function in it, you know?
Well, I think it's a question of intent. You know, if you're constantly examining yourself and trying to see how you could be a better person, that's very different than somebody who advocates for harm, you know. And I see that as very different.
Yep.
Yeah, I think like if you're in an engagement, sorry, Kyle, I was just saying real quick, is like if you're in a conversation with somebody and you see there's like zero willingness, they're being intentionally obstinate and difficult, then that's not a place to engage. That's a place that you can just disengage. But if you see that there's opportunity, I put in the chat here, these are Brene Brown. Many people know Brene Brown's work around empathy and things, but she has different prompts just that you can say. Such thing as like if somebody says something in a conversation, just being able to put out blanket, that's not been my experience. Just something as that to redirect or things. So there's a number of other ones there, whatever works for you. Sorry, Kyle, go ahead.
I was just sympathizing with that difficulty because, sorry, I was still in the Brene Brown quotes. My best, one of my closest three friends, is a guy who's in his mid to late 50s, who's a Black gentleman who I should say in full disclosure, I find myself code switching in 95% of conversations. I get around this person and everything's just like all the way, just 100. This guy's in his mid 50s and he's easily the most educated historian that I know by a long shot. He's also one of the most racist. He says so many racist things that it makes it almost impossible to be around him. My fiance is white. She's from Australia, and I dread the day that these two meet and find out that they're like my close friends. But you know, when we're talking about this this post the legacy of slavery on the psyche. And not just on the psyche of an individual, but on the residue that it leaves on a society that still inspires or still influences that individual. I see this person who doesn't necessarily have the ability to code switch, which comes with its own set of problems related to race as well. But I see this person who's extremely intelligent, extremely well learned, and who's spent, you know, a lot of their adult life battling with educators who were nowhere near qualified to decide whether this person, you know, should or shouldn't pass their class. And then I see it manifested in a very different way back at home. And I think that one of the interesting things about this group is that you guys are geographically located in an area where you get to see more than one world in a way that a lot of people that are like regionally constricted don't. And you know, for someone in Tennessee growing up, for someone in Tennessee, I should say that I see the way that the society has worked on me, and I see the way that it's worked on my father, for example, with two totally different outcomes, to the point that, you know, we don't speak, haven't spoken in years. And though I love the guy, I have to accept that if in my most generous estimation, I have to hope that the person he is not in effect, not the product of who he intended to be, but it's the effect of what being in Tennessee has done to him. And it's the greatest personal tragedy that I'm affiliated with. And I just say that to go into the point that my father's not a racist at all. My friend here in New York, I would not die on the hill of saying my friend's not a racist. That guy's probably, it could very well be argued that he is. My father, who I know isn't, is a proponent of easily some of the most racist social policies that he doesn't even, you know, he's never had the chance to find out how he's a product of those policies. And I think that goes so deeply into the class system. I think someone referenced earlier, maybe indirectly, they were referencing things that Isabel, I think it's Isabel Robinson, one who wrote that book Class, brought out so well in her book. It's an absolute must read for anyone who hasn't run across it.
Yeah, I think Shawn's got it there.
Yeah, I pull it off my bookshelf. Yeah, you go.
Yeah.
It's an absolute necessary for anyone who, especially anyone who looks at other people and thinks, how could they vote that way? But I've seen that in my father, and I respect that differentiation between people that willfully denigrate others specifically because of their race, or who assume things about others because of their race, or assume their own superiority over others because of their color, and people who are just naturally a product of a system. For example, even I, as someone who's, you know, doesn't subscribe to any religion, but especially any monotheistic Abrahamic personified God. Not that the ones in the East are any better, but I think some of it is more compatible with our scientific findings, or at least allows us space to explore. I'm incapable of escaping, you know, certain traces of the religiosity of the culture, of just being a Westerner, and I would hate to ever adopt the title of Westerner, you know. So I appreciate the exploration into that differentiation between racism and racist as an act and as a conscious way of being, and as a byproduct of one's upbringing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, from my own experience, you know, moving to a bigger city, I grew up in Southern Indiana, and just, yeah, the environment there, and really just also a lack of exposure. So what people were told from their parents about people of color, you know, they didn't have an experience to negate what they were told either, you know. And so educating yourself and getting out and exploring, I think it was Mark Twain that said, you know, travel is you know, I forget exactly how it goes, but, you know, travel is important to, you know, reduce your ignorance of cultures. And, you know, basically, yeah, the more traveling, the more cultures that you experience, you know, the less that racism would have a hold, because you would see, hopefully, you know, if you look without some bias, you would see that shared humanity and learn from it. But yeah, for me, that's helped a lot, you know, getting out, meeting new people, and being out of that culture. has made a big difference. But yeah, so many people who don't ever get out, who don't ever, try to learn or question those thoughts end up being more just a product of that environment, unfortunately.
So Mandy Twain said, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness.
Hey,
Thank you.
thanks, Mr.
I
Thanks,
had it for a minute and then it was gone. And I'm
thanks,
like,
Mark.
well, yeah.
Samuel
Yes.
Clemens.
Yes.
The reason I have it in my head is because one of the travel programs on television always ends with that quote.
Mhm.
So I hear it
Yeah.
every week when I watch it. So
Excellent.
Mhm. All right.
All right. Anybody else?
let's get some more people who aren't talking, other than the 3 or 4 of us who are dominating. There we go.
John Nagy,
John. Yeah.
go off mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, hear you now.
All right. Well, I'll just tell you about an experience since Mandy kind of got me into this, because I'm from Indianapolis, and I really didn't have any experience with Black folks until I was employed by this wholesale florist. And so I was part of a delivery team, and there were 5 of us, and I was the only white, and the other 4 were Black gentlemen. But what was great, and what I think of Mandy is, we didn't think of each other as, you're white, you're Black. We're all people. We got to know each other. And what was interesting about Indianapolis, and this was, late 60s, early 70s, I'd be driving the van with one of my buddies, and then we go, hey, let's go eat lunch over there. And he says, oh no, they don't let me in there. And I'm thinking, what's going on? And then, okay, something happened where, I was invited by my friends to go to one of their bars and have a drink. And so there I was in a Black bar, and then everybody looked at me, and they had to say, no, he's okay, he's with us. And so I got to experience, in my own little way, some of what happens. And that was a really telling thing for me. But what was great, again, was that to make these things happen, we have to experience each other as humans. We have to have relationships. We have to talk, do those kinds of things. And if we don't meet up with each other, then, oh my gosh, it's them versus us. Instead of, these are human beings, flesh like me, have their own anxieties and their own happiness and everything else, and we can celebrate together. And so that was my experience in the world, and thought I'd share it.
Thank you, John.
Definitely. Yeah. I think there is, I think that's very important when people are open and able to have those connections. I know some people will say, oh, well, these racist people, you just need to get more exposure to people of color and they'll just see it, and that doesn't happen. That's just.
I also want to be like, a lot of judges do things like that where they make people have like forced exposure. But it was like, what that does is put potential vulnerable communities at more risk sometimes.
Exactly.
Is that like a racist person or a sexist or homophobic person now has to like go meet with people. And so it was also like, sometimes it's just like, because there have been times where people have just been like mandated to like go experience something. I was like, that's not necessarily at this day and age. There's a whole lot of things on YouTube. There's a whole lot of things like podcasts. You can get some exposure without having to like a person potentially suffer that.
Exactly.
I have to go in a minute, but it was like one thing I just wanted to highlight. If people wanted to do their own kind of work around this, is that and Peter, if you want to maybe share this out, or Michelle, like share this out in an email too, is this is the YWCA of Cleveland link. Every March, the YWCA Cincinnati is also doing it this year for the first time, but this is the 3rd year now that YWCA of Cleveland is doing it. They do a 21-day racial equity challenge. So it'll start March 1st. And basically every day, Monday through Friday, you get an email. And it'll kind of say, if you want to spend 5 minutes, look at this article, or watch this like short video. If you want to spend a half hour, watch this TED Talk, or watch this video, or listen to this podcast. And so it's really powerful to like just sign up for those emails. I will tell you in an average month, because I've done it the last 2 years, as I said, like probably about half the days I actually open the emails, because it's like I will look at it that day, and other days it's just I'm too busy with work like to get to them. But it's nice to just have in my inbox to like look up. But it's like they'll look at education, history, voting rights, like health, like they just the carceral state, like, you know, pipeline to prison, like, you know, kind of all these different kind of systems, and like will really just kind of give you a lot of resources. So it's really good to just have so I have a colleague, Tanisha, that I work with at Youth at the Center, that like we get them, and then we kind of make time to just talk about some of the ones that like stood out to us, like every, you know, like when we kind of have gone it the last 2 years. It was like that's just something. You can also just do the same thing. YWCA in Cincinnati, they're also doing the 21-day equity challenge, doing kick it off on Monday. So I don't know if they're going to use all one for the state, or if Cincinnati is going to be a little bit more first level, because this is the first time they do it. So we'll see on Monday what shows up in my inbox. But if you're interested in that resource, check that out, and that's an opportunity to kind of do some learning.
Thanks. I'll post that. Yep.
Definitely. And also, yeah, if you're on social media and things, you know, following different speakers and different news sources to get those different perspectives helps a lot, you know. And I know many people probably already are doing that, but you know, that's one thing I've increased too, and it's really helped make me aware of things that, especially anniversaries of things or new events that I wouldn't have heard about necessarily otherwise. So
Michelle has been sending me interesting Zooms, and I post them on the homepage as events. I'm thinking we should, all these wonderful things, we should build a book page. And if you have anything you think everybody should see, get it to me.
Books and videos, right?
Books and videos, and let's start making these. Let's make the website more of a resource, and yeah, books and videos and Zooms, you know, Zooms and podcasts. Yeah, okay.
Idea.
I'd just like to mention.
I dropped some pictures.
Go ahead.
I dropped some pictures in the comments on the meetup. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier or not.
Oh, okay.
Don't know if it worked out right because I'm not very tech savvy. I've had a laptop for like 2 weeks, and I found myself finding out that most people don't get the stuff that I send them.
I see the chat remark, but I don't see links to anything.
Oh, I see some photos.
It's like, yeah, the photos. I dropped the photos just so like people would have a better understanding of who I am, because I could obviously be anybody, but like of what I do. So it's all geared towards homeless, helping people that live on the streets, which is
the photos don't show up in my chat.
Okay, cool.
Neither do I.
See him.
You're probably not
I see
missing
him on the
very
meetup.
much.
Yeah.
I'll ask around.
Yeah,
Somebody.
It's on the meetup.
I'll get them for Mandy.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah,
on the
that's awesome.
on the downside, I'm in all of them, so you may be fortunate to get it.
Oh, come on now.
We'll see if we can recognize you. Huh?
But I will be I would like to be in the loop on any resources that people have. Like I'm on another page looking up the 21-day challenge and making sure I get signed up for it. I'm definitely into getting anything like that.
Yeah, and
Good.
So one of the things Shawn mentioned was Camp Quest, which you may not have ever heard of, but Camp Quest was something this organization started 25 years ago. And it was essentially to create a summer camp for children of secular humanist families. And it expanded somewhat, and then it expanded a lot after FIG was no longer involved with it, and it expanded into 9 different camps around the USA and camps in Canada, Norway, the UK, Switzerland, all of them called Camp Quest. And not only was Shawn involved with that, but a number of the people who are still here at part of, in addition to Shawn, still a part of FIG. So in addition to next month's meeting, which is going to be on single payer healthcare, the following month, April, we're going to celebrate that 25th anniversary of Camp Quest. And the first hour of the meeting will be really about the FIG years. And the second hour will be what happened from then on, including a promotion for what Camp Quest is going to be doing this summer. And they are actually going to be, they're talking about an in-person camp, but not a residential, not an overnight camp.
Right.
So,
You know, so much of me coming to New York was just because I couldn't find any groups like this in Tennessee growing up. So
you
it's
know,
really,
I just want to tell you, the second Camp Quest, the first one after the one we did, was in the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, and it's still going and it's still there. And it's for secular humanist kids. I just thought I'd let you know, Tennessee was an active part of,
awesome.
yeah.
Well, Kyle,
A
I
little
hope
bit, little bit away from Nashville, but yeah, you were right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope that now that you found us, we'll see you more often, you know?
I'm certain you will. I'm certain you'll see me pretty regularly. I'm really
Good.
grateful to you guys for letting me be a part of the group tonight.
Well, we're happy to have you.
All right, I'm gonna check out here. I got a meeting coming up in
Oh,
15.
sure. Well, thank you so much for your participation tonight.
We should all, yeah, we should be wrapping up here.
Hasta la vistas.
Night.
Anything, any other announcements, Mandy? Anything else you want to tell people?
I thought that was the main things.
No, I just thought maybe you had more.
No, I did kind of the end announcements after Shawn had finished, just so that way if there was Q&A, sometimes people will have other things and drop off. So I tried to catch it then. But yeah, you can see our previous speakers. There'll be links on our website. You can also go on there to become a member or support us through Amazon Smile or Kroger. And see some of these resources as we get that put up too.
Shawn, I just wanted to say I knew you were going to have a good presentation, but the presentation exceeded my expectations. So thank you for that.
Agreed.
There you go, Shawn. Very good. Excellent.
I was
Excellent
able
work.
to come up with such a good presentation because I am sitting in a heated condo. Thanks to Frank.
Frank, thanks to Frank. All right, guys.
Yeah.
Frank
just came and replaced our furnace within it went out and he was here in a couple hours. So it was very, very responsive.
Oh goodness.
Hey, Frank.
Yep.
Adios, amigos. I'm going to cut it off.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.